Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the afternoon session of the Climate Solutions Series here at the 8th Annual Great Northern. My name is Eric Dayton. All right, 8 years. My name is Eric Dayton. I'm one of the co-founders and the board chair of the Great Northern. So as someone who's been here and involved from the very beginning, it's just really exciting to see all of you here today and to just see the festival growing year over year. We've got a lot going on this afternoon. There's more tomorrow. There's more coming up all week and next weekend. So if you haven't yet been to thegreatnorthernfestival.com to plan your schedule and look at all the great events, figure out what you want to attend, I hope you will and hope to see you out there over the days ahead. As I said, this is really our most ambitious festival yet, and that's thanks to all of your support. It's also thanks to the support of our great partners and our sponsors. I want to especially recognize the McKnight Foundation for their generous funding of our climate programming here this weekend. And, I was asked to kick off by sharing something that inspires me around winter and around climate. And I wanted to share something that is not happening right now, but that should be, and that's the U.S. Pond Hockey Championship. And this should be the second weekend. This should be championship weekend of the U.S. Pond Hockey Championship. It took place last weekend. I heard they had great ice. But this weekend, the ice isn't safe. They don't have the conditions they need on Lake Nokomis, so they had to make the really heartbreaking, difficult decision to cancel. And I think of all the players who don't get the chance to participate in the activity they love. I think of the organizers who I know well, who just pour their heart and soul into putting this event on. And I know it was just such a tough decision for them to have to make. And I remember when we first started the Great Northern, I used to sort of say, kind of half jokingly, when I was thinking about why it was important to include climate conversations alongside these winter events and these cherished winter traditions, that I didn't want to see the U.S. Pond Hockey Championship have to become the U.S. Roller Hockey Championship 50 years from now. And it was sort of a joke, but I was thinking 50 years, here we are only 8 years later, and we're facing that potential reality. And I know that's why we're all here today, to have these conversations, but just want to recognize, I think as we all felt walking in today in mid 40-degree weather in January, Minnesota, we know this just doesn't feel right. So that brings us to the topic at hand, which couldn't be more important, which is Minnesota climate leadership. And I think we can all be proud that our state is on the forefront nationally of implementing policy to both effectively and urgently tackle the climate crisis, which requires vision, but it also requires action. And so we're going to start our conversation today with two state agency leaders who are on really the front lines of implementation, Commissioner Grace Arnold from the Department of Commerce and Dr. Kate Knuth, who's the climate director at the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency. And they're going to be in conversation with NPR's political director, Brian Back. So I'll welcome our guests to the stage. Thank you.
Kate and Grace, I really appreciate you taking the time here. We don't have a ton of time, and I know that you guys have been doing a ton of work given the big pieces of legislation that have recently been passed. I want to point out a couple of them to get us going and thinking about things on the macro level, and we'll also pivot to the micro level after that. But the goal of the 2040 plan, which is 100% zero carbon electricity output by 2040, and then there's the carbon neutral goal of having the state be carbon neutral by 2050. How do those two work in concert, and how big of a challenge are they, Grace?
Yeah, so the 2040, by 2040, we'll have carbon-free electricity in the state. What that does is not only make one of our largest sources of emissions to be carbon-free. We are not the largest anymore, I'll point out, which is great. But it also allows for other sectors to decarbonize. So they can rely on electricity rather than natural gas or other kinds of fossil fuels. And so by making the electricity generation system carbon free, we're able to then have knock-on effects in other areas.
And sticking with you for a second, what state incentives are out there to assist the power providers to make this transition?
Sure. So we have a state competitiveness fund, which helps to match federal money, because there's actually quite a bit more federal money in both direct grants and tax credits. We received over $400 million in a public-private partnership at Commerce, which will help to build out transmission lines, which will help to get more clean resources online. So there are many moving pieces, but I think between the state and federal funds, and Minnesota's super well positioned to be, one, competitive, we're getting a lot of money in, but also we have kind of the tools at the state and federal level to help make that more affordable and faster.
And Kate, there are a lot of state agencies and boards that have eyes on this big venture. what needs to happen on a permitting front to ease this transition? You know, because legacy baseload power sources, taking them from that to the renewables that are smaller in scale, but they do require a lot of transmission.
Yeah, thank you for the question. I think, from a regulatory perspective, it's really important to think about what's the outcome, what we're looking for. And right now in climate work, we actually need to build a fair amount of stuff. We need to do a lot of stuff. And we need to make sure we're doing that in a way that protects Minnesotans, the environment we live in Minnesota, and the way of life we so value. And that, at this point, takes building clean, carbon-free energy and better ways of managing waste and all of these things. And that takes, many of those will take going through our permitting process. And that permitting process has a really important role. It's there to protect our way of life and our health and our environment. And so we need to make sure those two things are working together. There's a lot more complexity than that, but I will leave it there as like one of the big tensions and one of the challenges that we're having to figure out in the months and years to come.
And how should we be thinking about measuring whether these new energy options, whether it's the production or use side, are having a meaningful effect on pollution or consumption and some of these other metrics?
So do you want, I could jump in, like, we need to get less carbon dioxide and methane and other greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. We need to be doing that less. That is, like, we think about that all the time. It's super important. And there are a whole bunch of other pollutants that have real health impacts on folks, like nitrous oxide or sulfur dioxide. And a lot of these have real environmental justice impacts in terms of BIPOC communities that are more heavily impacted for a whole host of historic policy reasons. And so we need to be aware not just of the singular greenhouse gas emissions, climate pollution reduction goal. It's super important. And we need to be bringing in those other pollution.
So if I'm hearing you right, though, it's not just measuring the particles in the air, but maybe what the health effects are in some of these communities that have been affected in the past? For sure,
yes.
Is there anything that you're going to be doing to measure whether these changes are having a real effect?
Yeah, so we put out a greenhouse gas emissions report annually. So we have data that backs up, all the work that we're doing. One of the things that we've started to think about more, and so I toured the Sabathani Community Center, and they have this really cool, they want to put solar on, they want to do ground source heat pump for their new senior living. But the most important thing for them was to make their air more healthy because they have the highest rates of asthma. So there are measures like asthma rates that, I think as we get farther in this journey, we'll want to start looking at to say this is important from a, sort of macro, hard to like see and feel greenhouse gas emissions. But the way you see and feel it is in things like your kids can go outside and they don't have to, stay inside in the summer because they can't breathe.
A lot of the work that institutions, government agencies are doing is kind of at the macro level, as we talked about. At the micro level, there's still a lot of things that we need to see about the availability of electric vehicles, heat pumps, induction stoves. Where's that tipping point between availability and the broad embrace of that?
I think we're living that tipping point right now. I mean, I think I've worked on climate change in Minnesota for my career, and we've never had a moment like we have now with the federal investment, with the historic nation-leading policy and investments that were passed during the last legislative session. And in climate change debates, conversations, there can be this tension between individual and collective action. We frankly need both. And I think the exciting thing, there's many exciting things. One of the exciting things about this moment is a collective policymaking that's happened with the Commerce Department and coalitions of advocates pushing for 100% clean energy, the leadership of our governor. Now when I plug in my electric vehicle, it's cleaner than it was a few years ago, and it will continue to get cleaner. And I have a cabin near Grand Rapids. Grand Rapids got a fast charger 2 years ago. So it used to make me a little nervous to go to the cabin. Now it's not nervous because I can plug in my car and go to Brood Awakenings and have lunch, and my daughter gets to pick out a treat, and it's great. And so these collective and individual decisions are like building on each other. So I think we're at a tipping point moment now, which is exciting and slightly overwhelming at times.
You might be, I don't know whether to put you in the early adopter or where you adopted this, but there still are people out there who are concerned about reliability. And you talked about your cabin up in Grand Rapids, but how do we make sure that people have confidence that when they flip that switch, the lights are going to come on, or there's enough juice to get someplace far from home if they're not just commuting in the city?
Well, so we have added an Office of Reliability and also security. There are other things like cybersecurity that are important to a reliable grid that are not dependent on the generation. So we've added an office to really focus on that within our department. We have a regulatory arm that's like the least sexy part of this, although I'm really proud of them. They're a great team, but it's, they're the ones who are looking at all of the numbers of all the utilities and saying, yeah, we think this is this, but we need reliability, and doing all of that balancing and then advocating for the public interest at the Public Utilities Commission. And so we have a process that's really robust, gets a ton of public input, and kind of tests out the plans and the system, which doesn't happen in every other state. And that really planful mentality that we have here, I think, is great. And it will help us to make sure that we do, you don't want to think about it. You just want to flip on the light and it's going to be clean. And that's the goal.
We have a lot of people who know about the federal tax credits to buy electric vehicles. There's a state rebate that was passed in the last session. I don't know if it's come on board yet. If it's not, can you fill us in on when that is and what the parameters are? Who can qualify? How much?
Sure. So it's income qualified. So, and I would say, because there are more rules that we will have time for, and not that it's overly burdensome, but go to EV rebates, mn.gov EV rebates, and you will find all of the eligibility criteria there. It will be live very soon.
How much is out there for people? I mean, is it a limited program where it's first come, first serve?
It is a limited program, and it's first comes, first serve. If I remember correctly, it's $7 million. It's not a ton. I expect it will go pretty fast, but that might be a good signal to the legislature, in the future to start looking at that as a program to plus up, next year.
And we're running out of time here, but the infrastructure law and the Inflation Reduction Act, they both have programs that are moving in the clean energy direction. Is there anything in there that you think hasn't been getting enough attention that you think will have a big magnitude?
Organizations that don't have tax appetites can take tax credits through the IRA in particular.
What do you mean by tax appetites?
So I think everybody has an appetite for taxes, right? No, so if you're a nonprofit or school district or a lot of those entities that wouldn't normally pay taxes, that if you do an incentive through a tax mechanism, then you're like leaving out that whole set of organizations. The IRS you are able to get that value even if you don't pay taxes, and that I think will allow a whole other set of entities to take advantage of that funding that's like in a specific mechanism that they otherwise wouldn't. And a lot of them, school districts, we have a Solar on Schools program. Between that and the tax rebates, then that makes the cost of the solar panels that many schools want to put on, minimal.
I think we could go on for hours about what's in these bills, but I think your boss is also eager to get up here because he's been very excited about some of these programs that have been put in place. And I appreciate you guys coming forward to talk.
Thank you.
Thank you.
It's now my honor to introduce Governor Tim Walz, who has set the vision for Minnesota's climate leadership since taking office in 2019. This has included historic investments in public transit, a big push behind EVs to make Minnesota a clean car state, and it was just discussed, passing legislation to make Minnesota's electricity zero emissions by 2040. My research led to almost 36 other climate-friendly policies that have been passed under his leadership, but you don't want to hear me list them off. You want to hear from our governor. So with that, please join me in welcoming Governor Walz.
Okay. Appreciate it. Thanks, Brian.
Well, Governor, they billed this as a fireside chat, and I don't see a fireplace, so I brought my own.
Very nice.
I'll try to keep it up here, but I think it'll probably fall over. well, Governor, a lot of these things we're talking about are these far in the distance goals, and what kind of mileposts are you watching for? Because the goals are going to be met or not met long after you're gone.
No, that's right. Well, first of all, thanks for having us. Eric, thank you for putting this together. And can I note with the commissioner and the director, these two great leaders, look, you get one hire wrong and you get blamed for everything. I've done some really good ones, so thank you both. Yeah. I think for all of you, that's the hardest thing. If you can't see it in front of you, that we're trying to make generational change, and some of these things that we're impacting, talking 2040, I know there's folks in the room that we understand that is not aggressive as it needs to be, but it's the practical place of where we can try and get to. The problem is keeping political will while you're trying to hit those milestones. So I think Brian's question is really pertinent. We're going to have to show success along the way, whether it be implementation of these policies or starting to see some of the goals that we're getting, whether it's air quality issues, fewer days where we have air quality alerts. We're going to have to be able to show some of those things, but with an understanding. The scope of what we're trying to do is so big, and if people can't connect A to B, it's hard to keep the political will up. And so I acknowledge that's
to that point, you can have these institutional accountability, but the psychology,
that's right.
Like, how do I know that if it's so far off, what do I need to do now to adapt to my habits?
Well, I think listening to Kate talk about this, we need to have enough chargers where people lose range anxiety, and then that becomes a normal part of their daily life. I would say that those rebates also are EV bikes, so we get more of that, get people out there, where you start to see people are like, look, my bill's no higher, the lights came on, I feel good about what I'm doing, and we're seeing a secondary market in EVs start to show up. We're going to have people in their real life start to do this. If they're not an early adapter, they're not taking a chance, it becomes much more normal. And that's going to take some of that early build out.
I know you don't get a lot of say as governor as to how you get around because there's security detail and so forth, but when might you get an EV for personal or official use? Yeah,
and this we've talked about this and I would say this too. It came up, and some don't want to talk about it. They're modernizing the residence for the governor. I said, how does it not have a heat pump and solar panels? We have a pollinator field there that's really good and been doing some things. So I think it's a question that we brought up, and it comes to this. Well, we need a vehicle that's this big. We need a security vehicle. There might always be a reason. So I think for me, I don't drive myself right now. My kids are nervous. I don't forgotten how.
But you do have a new driver in your house. Are you thinking about one for him?
Yes, we have an old Subaru for him or whatever, but we are talking about trying to move forward. And now you see a lot. And that was you saw the very public fight I had with the auto dealers about moving to EVs. I told them, look, I'm not the CEO of General Motors that moved to fully EV. It's coming, and we need to build. And these are the same people that fought seatbelt laws when they came because we weren't going to be able to afford a car. But I do hear them on this. This is, whenever we're making these changes, this is a massive readjustment for the auto industry, because one of the things is, especially car dealerships, there's not going to be a whole lot of back office shop work because these EVs don't require as much. You're not changing the oil. You're not doing some of those things. So we're going to get there. I do think it's important to model that behavior. I don't right now. But look, I'm not a hypocrite in this. There's going to be a transition period here. I drive an old International. Someone noted it gets 18 miles to the gallon. Yeah, that is true. People are going to make some of these decisions. I think making it easier for people to make them is going to be critical.
Let's shift now to this power source overhaul that's in place. Can this happen fast enough without government incentives or nudges?
No, and I think government has to set the bar up there, and I think we've seen this time and time again where we've seen it, whether it was reducing acid rain, sulfur dioxide, those types of things. Once we made it into place, we attacked it with some of the scrubbers we got there. Now, I do know that some of this, the technology's not there yet, but if government doesn't incentivize it, we are not going to get there. And so I think it's critically important that we stay on the forefront of this. Once again, building a collaboration enough with the business community, with the power generators, and of course the public. Because look, you can have the best idea, you can have the best science behind you, but if you can't get the social will to buy into it, which I know a little about during COVID. So, by the way, we have vaccines for measles, so just keep that in there that we're hearing it again. But you see the problem there. And that's going to be a challenge.
I'm going to keep you on focus and away from COVID because otherwise Claire will get mad here. But the Inflation Reduction Act, as you heard the commissioner talk about, it's a lot of tax-driven policy that's premised on action, maybe, and result better than concepts where, like the promise of something new. How is Minnesota being intentional in positioning to receive some of this federal money?
Yep. I didn't know we were going to do this. We got asked Thursday night. I took a call yesterday morning from Secretary Granholm, the Department of Energy, talking about Minnesota wants to be one of the early states. The federal government wants to be there for, I believe it's the HEAT and the HERES Act, Commissioner, that you track all these, that homes, and so we're trying to. These are things to modernize, and especially for folks. Again, if you are wealthy enough to put solar panels on your house, you get a $7,500 rebate. If you don't have any money, a $7,500 rebate doesn't do you much good at all. These programs are meant to incentivize folks who don't have the pay in on that side of it to make sure that we're building some social justice around the capacity to do this. She called and said Minnesota is going to be in this because every single program that we had this year, we did the state match. You saw it earlier this week. We put $400 million in to being ready for the Blotnick Bridge. That translated into $1.1 billion from the federal government, $400 million from Wisconsin. That same concept is on this IRA that the commissioner and her team, the folks at MPCA, MnDOT, we front-loaded our matching funds on every single thing across the board. And that's why I think we'll be more competitive than a lot of states.
You don't have a lot of money to work with this in this coming session. It is a bonding session. So are you thinking about things where there's a federal program that I can extract money, that's where the first dollar is going to go?
Yeah, absolutely. And the reason I tell all of you this, look, you know this, there's very few states. I think only 4 other states receive less federal money back than they pay in. We're a donor state for many of these things. And we're glad to help the rest of the country on this, but we're positioned well enough now that we should be extracting every one of those. And I think that was my argument. We can't leave any of that on the table. And these grants continue to be awarded to Minnesota because we front loaded it. And I think that will continue on. This is going to take decades on some of these programs that are starting to get funded. It's going to take the next 10 years to get a lot of this money out. We want to be on the front end because it goes back to Brian's first question. That starts to accelerate milestones where people see this as really working. If it just becomes philosophical that we need to adapt climate change, I'm a teacher in me, Maslow's hierarchy. Don't just self-actualize around climate change. Make it affordable, make us make money off it, let us be comfortable in it, then you get better buy-in.
Well, and to your point, it seems as though a lot of this money in the Inflation Reduction Act is front-loaded and it will taper, but a lot of these programs and changes take time. What changes need to happen in the state regulatory policy or legal policy to make sure that that's not a hindrance?
Yeah, you hear a lot about this, and I think we want to make sure, look, one of the hardest things to do is to build a power line. Only more difficult is a pipeline. And those are very difficult, as they should be, because they need to make sure we're doing things in the proper way. I think one of the things that looking at the agencies, we do a pretty good job of this. It's a bit of a myth that we're slow on it, but are there ways that we can accelerate without going around the regulations, make sure we're getting, because I'm worried if we can't build power lines to move, we've got so many kilowatts, the commissioner knows more than I do, across the country, so many kilowatts of stranded renewable energy that we can't move because we don't have power lines. So I'm interested in everything. I did a symposium out in California working with someone about states that are burying power lines around their states right away. Now, MnDOT doesn't want me to talk about that, but the fact is it makes sense. Again, we're going to have to build power lines.
Is that something you're looking at?
Climate resistant. We're really looking at it. And we have Esri, some of you know Esri, the mapping company, they mapped Minnesota for us and showed us, and you can put your numbers in there and show what it costs to run a power line from a wind farm out in North Dakota to Duluth. And if we ran it on state right-of-ways, meaning you wouldn't have to do EISs, you wouldn't have to go through all that, and you could bury it under the state existing right-of-way, so you would have no issues with land ownership and those things. That's how we're going to have to start thinking about this if we're going to move quickly.
Where to you is the bigger payoff? Is it in the power that results in and where that comes from, or is it the jobs that might accompany some of this conversion?
They're totally intertwined. If we got to move beyond this, and that's my job of doing a better job of selling this. It's not salesmanship, but it's educating the public that this isn't a choice between addressing climate change and hurting the economy. We can't have stranded assets in coal and things like that. We're going to have to figure out that it is both our fiduciary responsibility to move towards that. So I think they work hand in hand. It's great the job you can, and that gets people motivated. Look, the labor unions are all behind this because it's massive jobs in this new clean energy economy that's coming, and that works out for everybody.
I'm glad you brought up coal because North Dakota is already making rumblings that they might even sue over Minnesota's requirements and the ramifications that might have on the power that state produces and exports to western Minnesota. Are you concerned by litigation holding this back?
Well, we're always ready for. I'm sure they don't like our flag either, but whatever it is, it gets them. So, look, we're going to have to move on. I get it. North Dakota's economy is based on fossil fuels. I mean, that's just the way it is. We're going to have to figure out how to make it sure that North Dakota has ability to transition. again, we're realistic in this. We're going to need to, as we transition out of some of these things, it's going to be a glide path. I'm deeply concerned about this. We're using nuclear power to try and help meet this, and it's one that I think concerns a lot of us. What I'm most concerned about is isn't it weird that all of our nuclear plants are usually based on indigenous land or somewhere where they get to store the cask, we get the energy. We're going to have to figure that piece out. I think the same goes with North Dakota. I am deeply concerned this idea of the red state, blue state map, and we're not in this together. We can't solve this issue by Minnesota alone. And that's the people who say, well, we shouldn't even try them. That's ridiculous. Of course we should. But yes, we need to be ready to defend ourselves. We can win.
But as I look around the neighborhood, Minnesota is taking a lot of steps that its neighbors aren't. Does it matter if we're all on the same page here? Or is Minnesota planning to going to be on this pedestal in the region?
No, we need them in, but I hope what they're looking at when Helene, the largest manufacturer of solar panels in North America, decided to build in Minnesota, there's a reason they decide to build here. We're trying to make this case that we have now one of the best business climates, especially when it comes to dealing with climate. So when we go to Norway, they tell us we're not putting any factories in any state that's not able to provide us 100% clean energy by this time. Same with Japan, same with South Korea. So I think what's going to happen here at some point in time, they're going to have to start moving in that direction. And I think we're glad to help them. But I'm not going to get left behind on this. We're not going to be the state that's not prepared for the move, not leading on the move, not creating the jobs.
What about small-scale nuclear? What space does that occupy in this conversation?
Well, I know this is controversial. I think it's almost impossible. I guess I did not tell you the truth on this. Power line.
Wow.
Power. No, I said the hardest thing to do is to license a pipeline. A nuclear plant is harder to license. But look, some of you are looking. I understand the passion that around this. I think when you're weighing out the existential threat and what poses a bigger threat, trying to figure out if some of these new modular reactors that you can license during construction, they're not water cooled, they have the capacity. I understand the waste issue we still have to deal with, but I do think that there's a role to talk about it and get it right. But I just don't think that we can depend on the ability to be able to license that or have some type of centralized storage. So I think it's the right thing to keep that on there, but it's not a realistic possibility it's going to happen quickly.
Well, wind, solar, and the like tend to be used more locally, but you are trying to get more on the grid to move this power around. How are you planning to get past some of this resistance you're finding, in rural areas in particular about these transmission lines and the NIMBYism that's out there?
Yeah, this is tough. And there's a fascinating discussion on the CO2 pipelines that folks who were enthusiastic about an oil pipeline were not going to have a CO2 pipeline in there. And I think some of that became, and look, they're dangerous too. I don't get me on that, but I think it was because you got some people say, I don't want to be part of the solution. I don't want to try and feel it. And you can argue whether a CO2 pipeline from a ethanol plant is actually progress or not. But the issue being is that people are digging in. I don't know. I thought by this time, look, in 2006, I got elected to Congress. One of the first events I did was in New Ulm. Bishop Chilstron of the ELCA in New Ulm held a roundtable with myself as the new congressman, with Governor Pawlenty and with Will Steger, talking about Minnesota's renewable fuel standard leading the nation, and we were going. We were united. Remember when Nancy Pelosi and Newt Gingrich sat on the couch and talked about climate change together? My God, here we sat. So I think for all of us, it's incumbent upon me. These are the experts. The power folks are out there. The advocates in this room who know how to make it happen. My job is have to build more of this political will around it. I think you have to sell it that our economic well-being, first and foremost, is tied to us addressing climate in a real positive way.
You bit off those big goals last year and kind of set them in place. Is this more or less the implementation year, or is there another big objective that you're planning to push forward in this session?
Well, this is the implementation year. I see you smiling on that. So, yeah, look, we got a lot done, but I think the mistake here is to see that we go in fits and starts. If there's things that are working and that we need to continue to move forward on, we should take a look at those. And I think we are really seeing it now. We're going to get more buy-in. This issue around climate justice, we've seen it, whether it's Smith Foundry issue or some of these things, that the public is really tuned into this. They really want to be adjusted. And I think there's maybe some things in that regards where we look at ways that we can help make that happen. But we've got a lot to do. We have to implement it. And your question is still, my fear is if we don't do it quick enough and show milestones, we lose the public will on this. And then that translates into, we get folks in who said, let's just rescind that 2040 thing and go back to burning coal. That's a real danger because we don't get another shot at this. And that's why I think all we were thinking, this was the moment, this was the time. If all of the things we did this year are rescinded and we go back to the status quo, we're not going to get a shot at it again.
Governor, we're going to have to leave it here. It's been interesting to see how this conversation has moved from should we do it to how are we going to do it?
Yes.
And that's kind of what I guess is
And that's on
you'll
us.
be watching.
No, that's on us working together to get it right. And I just encourage folks we have to talk about one another on this and show some real progress, because this moment it will pass if we're not careful. And I do think seeing the economics start to catch up with us, that's a really positive thing. So thank you all for being here. And I wish I was here for Anders Zimmer. He's coming too. That's
well, he's one of the many good speakers yet to come in, and I encourage people to stick around for the next one, which is Emerging Careers in Climate. And if you want to see the full list of speakers, you can go to thegreatnorthernfestival.com. This is all made possible in part by people who donate. So if you see those QR codes around, make sure you click on that and put a few bucks toward that. Otherwise, there's lots of great programs between now and February 4th. I'm sure you're probably going to that Last Supper dinner tomorrow.
I saw him talk about this last week, some of our endangered plants that we're not going to have a chance to have. It's pretty tragic. Some of us older folks always used to say this, the bananas were better when we were younger. It's true, they were. And that's a problem. That's climate. So,
well, Governor
Tim
Walz, thanks for
Thank you all. That was great. Thanks. I'll hand this back.